In the film Die Hard, both the villain Hans Gruber and the protagonist John McClane compare John to the cowboy heroes of classic Hollywood.
Thinks he's John Wayne, Marshall Dillon.
I was always kind of partial to Roy Rogers, actually.
This comparison is again invoked in the climax, as Hans holds John's wife at gunpoint and mockingly says that this time
John Wayne does not walk off into the sunset with Grace Kelly.
Hans is of course referring to the 1952 western High Noon, which also climaxed with the bad guy holding the hero's wife at gunpoint. But Hans gets one crucial detail wrong, one that John is only too eager to correct. John Wayne wasn't in High Noon.
This Gary Cooper, asshole.
Enough jokes.
It's a fun gag that ties up the film's western motif nicely, but the mix-up of actors is interesting. Maybe Hans's mistake was simply to show that he's a snooty European, ignorant of the specificities of the American Western.
Benefits of a classical education.
On the other hand, the confusion is understandable. Both actors had a long legacy of playing tough men of action in a litany of classic westerns, and both even won Oscars for playing a grizzled cowboy. In fact, when Cooper won his Oscar for High Noon, the person who accepted the award on his behalf was John Wayne, and in Wayne's acceptance speech, he even joked about giving his managers and his agents hell for not getting him cast in High Noon instead.
I'm gonna go back and find my business manager and agent, producer, and find out why I didn't get High Noon instead of Cooper.
But there's a grand irony at the center of both Hans's mix-up and Wayne's quips. John Wayne hated High Noon. He thought it was the most un-American thing he'd ever seen in his whole life, the antithesis of everything the Western was supposed to be. John Wayne hated High Noon so much that 7 years after the film was released, he'd make a Western of his own as a direct rebuttal. A little movie called Rio Bravo. So, what's the deal? Why did John Wayne hate this Western so much? And how did that hatred lead to Rio Bravo? To answer these questions, first we need to discuss what High Noon even is in the first place. The film is set in Hadleyville, a fictional small town in New Mexico. We begin with the wedding of the town marshal Will Kane to his beautiful bride Amy. Kane is retiring as marshal, with he and Amy set to move to a new town and start a quiet, simple life together. That is until Kane hears word that Frank Miller, a vicious criminal Kane had previously put away, has been pardoned for his crimes, and is aboard the noon train to Hadleyville with revenge on his mind, and 3 fellow killers waiting to join him at the station. Kane is urged to run, but a combination of obligation to the town, even if he isn't technically their marshal anymore, and a conviction that even if they do run, Miller will just hunt them down anyway, convinces Kane to stay and fight. But as Kane attempts to rally allies for a showdown at High Noon, he quickly learns that virtually no one will stand with him. One by one, all the townsfolk, all Kane's supposed friends, turn him down.
So long, Mark.
Even Amy, a devout Quaker and pacifist, refuses to stand by such violence, committing to leave Hadleyville with or without her husband. As the clocks strike 12 and Miller's gang strolls into town, Will Kane sets off to meet them alone. From one perspective, this seems like a pretty agreeable Western, the kind Wayne himself might have starred in. We have a town in trouble from despicable gunslingers, a valiant hero standing for what is right, played by a veritable icon of the genre, and a climax where, spoilers, wife returns to her husband's side and the hero successfully guns down all the bad guys. John Wayne may not walk off into the sunset with Grace Kelly, but Gary Cooper rides out with Grace in the afternoon sun. What was Wayne's problem with that? Well, first off, there's politics to consider. High Noon was made at the height of the Hollywood blacklist, when former or suspected communists were barred from working in the film industry. Conservative organization the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, sexy name, I know, was formed with the express goal of ridding Hollywood of communist influence and lefty activist types, inviting the House Un-American Activities Committee, aka HUAC, to investigate the alleged infiltration of communism in Hollywood in a series of public hearings. While the Motion Picture Alliance provided a steady stream of friendly witnesses to preach the dangers of communism and attest communists were spreading through Hollywood, former or suspected members of the Communist Party were called to testify by HUAC, expected to confess their political affiliations, renounce the ideologies of communism, and name names of either former or current party members. One former party member was Carl Foreman, the screenwriter of High Noon. Foreman had joined the Communist Party in the 1930s, influenced by both the Great Depression and the party's initially strong stand against the rise of fascism in Europe. And while he would grow disillusioned and eventually leave the party well before writing High Noon, he did remain politically left. Moreover, Foreman knew his past associations meant it was only a matter of time before he was called to testify, and he watched in horror as the first round of witnesses, who'd come to be known as the Hollywood 10, had their First Amendment rights trampled and were charged with contempt of Congress for refusing to answer HUAC's questions. He would also watch with disdain as Hollywood refused to support the 10, instead complying with HUAC. It wasn't just the parade of friendly witnesses willing to do what the Hollywood 10 wouldn't and name names, whether motivated by their own anti-communist convictions or more simply self-preservation. It was the major studio heads agreeing not to hire any of the Hollywood 10, or any other witness who refused to acquiesce to HUAC's demands. It was the gradual capitulation of Hollywood liberals, initially supportive of the Hollywood 10 on the grounds of free speech, who slowly walked back their support in the face of mounting pressures from HUAC, the Motion Picture Alliance, and the mainstream press. It was the complete collapse of anything that could be called a community, broken by fear of an outside threat, and bound by a desperate hope that those that laid low and kept their heads down long enough would make it out okay. By Foreman's own admission, these events shaped High Noon. The screenplay became an allegory for the Hollywood blacklist. Miller and his gang were HUAC, an oppressive force hell-bent on destroying any perceived enemies and sowing discord in the spaces they entered. Hadleyville was Hollywood, the community gripped by fear of that encroaching evil, sacrificing their morals and turning a blind eye to injustice in the hopes of self-preservation. Will Kane was the embodiment of the unfriendly witnesses who stood up to HUAC, deserted by friends and colleagues more concerned with protecting themselves and forced to go it alone against seemingly insurmountable odds. He may well have been Foreman himself, who was indeed called to testify during High Noon's production and was too deserted by his friends. Stanley Kramer, Foreman's producing partner on High Noon and several other films prior, initially promised to stand by his friend, but shortly after changed gears, pushing Foreman out of their production company and forcing him to rescind his producer credit on High Noon as part of his severance package. And just as High Noon ends with Kane and his wife fleeing a town that has failed them and cast them out, so too did Foreman and his family flee their home, setting off for England. What was John Wayne up to in the midst of all this? Oh, nothing much. He was just the literal president of the Motion Picture Alliance, working hand in hand with HUAC. After Foreman's testimony, where he refused to name names or admit his own party membership, Wayne even tried to bully Foreman into going back to HUAC and acquiescing to their demands. Suffice it to say, Wayne, a deeply committed conservative, was very aware of Foreman's left-wing politics and was adamantly opposed to them. So surely the hatred for High Noon is self-evident, right? John Wayne was leading a crusade against what he saw as a dangerous ideology that threatened his country and his industry. Carl Foreman wrote an allegory where Wayne and his friends were the villains, and the hero was a stand-in for the blacklisted writers who had their livelihoods threatened and their family lives shattered. Case closed. But it's not quite so simple. Foreman may have intended High Noon as an anti-blacklist picture, but he did not share that with his collaborators, and they had different intentions. Producer Stanley Kramer may have been a liberal with a penchant for social issue movies, but he wasn't about to antagonize HUAC, especially when he was on the cusp of entering a multi-picture deal with Columbia Pictures, and was even being eyed at the time as a potential successor to studio head Harry Cohn. Gary Cooper certainly wasn't interested in making an anti-blacklist movie. Coop wasn't just buddies with John Wayne and a host of other Hollywood conservatives, he was also a literal charter member of the Motion Picture Alliance and a friendly witness for HUAC. Unlike most friendly witnesses, Cooper never named names, and he was also a good friend with Carl Foreman despite being very aware of his lefty politics, and he generally kept a low profile politically. In these respects, he was much more moderate than a John Wayne or other, more committed members of the Alliance, but all the same, he was no radical, and he wasn't about to make a movie explicitly condemning the very organization he was a part of. Even the film's director, Fred Zinnemann, who made his directorial debut with the pro-labor, anti-capitalist film Ritas, was skeptical of High Noon's subversive qualities. Said Zinnemann in 1992, Foreman saw High Noon as an allegory on his own experience of political persecution in the McCarthy era. With due respect, I felt this to be a narrow point of view. For Zinnemann, the film's meaning was much broader. The widespread cowardice in the face of a tyrant isolating part of the community and inflicting violence upon them could have just as well been an allegory for the rise of Nazism and the persecution of Jews in Germany. Zinnemann, a Jew who grew up in Austria in the 1910s and 20s, whose parents were murdered in the Holocaust, and who made many a movie contending with the evils of Nazi Germany before and after High Noon, may well have been thinking that during the film's production. One person who picked up on that subtext was director Wolfgang Petersen, who first saw High Noon as a young boy growing up in the devastation of post-war Germany and saw the film as a reflection of his own world, a community afraid to talk about the violence in their past, and a yearning for a hero to break that silence and stand up for what is right. But there's an elasticity to High Noon's meaning, evident in the many different ways different people have interpreted the film. In 1989, the Polish Solidarity Union repurposed a High Noon publicity still for a campaign poster in Poland's first free election after 4 decades of one-party communist rule. Will Kane positioned here as a stand-in for Polish citizens standing up to their communist government. When Republican Peter King broke from the party and voted against impeaching Bill Clinton in 1998, he compared himself to Will Kane in High Noon, standing alone for what he believed was right. Speaking of Bill, Clinton has stated High Noon is his all-time favorite movie, but the film has remained a popular choice for White House screenings with Democrat and Republican presidents. In his book on the making of High Noon, Glenn Frankel argues that the film's anti-blacklist subtext is almost illegible when viewed today, decades removed from the historical period that produced it. Frankel also compares High Noon to its seemingly ideological opposite On the Waterfront, another 1950s Hollywood film infused with a blacklist subtext. Except, unlike Carl Foreman, Waterfront's director Elia Kazan was not an unfriendly witness for HUAC. Kazan named names, and On the Waterfront story presents protagonist Terry Malloy's naming of names as the ultimate act of heroism and bravery, what Orson Welles famously called a celebration of the informer. Certainly sounds opposed to High Noon's conflation of HUAC as a gang of killers and the film's condemnation of the cowardly townsfolk who let them go unchallenged. But as Frankel points out, the films look pretty similar when placed next to each other. Both are about brave men who, when abandoned by friends and allies, choose to stand alone against evil forces and triumph. There is a broad applicability to High Noon's allegory. Virtually anyone who believes themselves righteous in their actions and standing alone can see themselves in this character, regardless of the specific politics. Which is not to say that there's nothing explicitly left or anti-capitalist in High Noon. Most notable is a scene where Kane arrives in church to ask for help against Miller. Amidst the congregation is Kane's friend, town mayor Jonas Henderson. Jonas stands to speak, at first seemingly in support of Kane, thanking him for all he's done for the town. But the longer he talks, the more the tone shifts. Jonas reveals that businesses up north are considering investing in Hadleyville, an influx of capital that would massively raise the town's wealth. But those investors might get cold feet if they hear about gunfights and chaos in town. Jonas concludes that Kane should leave.
I think you better go while there's still time. It's better for you, and it's better for us.
Kane will inevitably clash with Miller's gang eventually, and someone is going to die. But there's no need in Jonas's mind that those deaths occur on Hadleyville streets and jeopardize the town's prospects. It is a transparent favoring of capital over human life, and trumping any considerations of morality. Yes, Miller is a threat to the town. Yes, the townsfolk owe much to Kane, more, in Jonas's words, than could ever be paid back with money. But as it happens, Hadleyville has a chance to come into a lot of money at Kane's expense, and the indisputable logic under capitalism is that they should take it. The life of one man, however great, cannot compare to the wealth expansion of an entire town. The film underlines the crassness of the betrayal in the quick cut to a shocked Kane at Jonas's turn, in the eyes of the townsfolk, unable to meet Kane's gaze, and in Cooper's targeted delivery of Kane's one-word response.
Thanks.
For my money, this is the most morally indefensible betrayal in the film. Others, like Kane's wife or his mentor, the previous marshal, refusing to stand by him, might have cut Will deeper, but those were also more defensible. Amy was motivated by principles, her belief in pacifism, and a hope that there must be a better way to resolve conflict. Martin, the former marshal, is visibly worn down, missing a step. In his own words, more a liability than an asset. He's also bitter, bemoaning that years of service get you little more than a tin star and a quiet death alone in a ditch somewhere, and given the townsfolk's willingness to let Kane go it alone against Miller's gang, he might have a point. Buried beneath both these arguments is Martin's unspoken but quite evident fear. Fear that if he helps his friend, he's going to die. You could call him, and many of the other townsfolk, cowards for refusing to help. But I am very sympathetic to anyone fearing for their life. But Jonas is not fearing for his life. He, like Kazan, is fearing for his wealth. If there's any left-wing messaging in High Noon beyond anti-Blacklist and anti-HUAC, it's here, the moral failings and inaction spurred by the logic of capitalism. But there's also glimmers of anti-socialist and even pro-capitalist messaging in the film. Film critic Robin Wood notes that High Noon expresses a contempt for the masses, embodied in the widespread cowardice and moral failing of the Hadleyville citizens, while, quote, celebrating the charismatic hero who goes it alone, elevating the rugged individual in competence and morality above the people. Apart from Kane, one of the few townsfolk to be portrayed with any strength and respect is the businesswoman Helen Ramirez. Ramirez does not stand with Kane and join his fight. When she hears that Frank Miller is returning to Hadleyville, she opts to leave town. Unlike the other townsfolk, however, Ramirez has a personal history with both Miller and Kane.
You're gonna talk different when Frank Miller gets here. You might want somebody around you then when you try and explain to him about Kane.
And it's very likely she will be targeted directly if she stays.
Only from what I've heard, you might not be so pretty when he gets through with you.
I think you ought to get out of town. I might not be able to, well, you know how he is.
Her leaving is highly rational. Moreover, unlike the bulk of the town's dithering about what is to be done, Ramirez is composed and assured. She takes a moment to consider the best course of action, and then she acts, selling her stake in Hadleyville's general store and skipping town. Her business partner thanks Helen, not just for selling her stake, but for being a silent partner in the store from the start, and always treating him kindly. And it's implied that in her own quiet way, Helen Ramirez has been as much a pillar of Hadleyville as Will Kane. She is a counterpoint to Jonas Henderson. If that character represented the ills of capitalist influence rotting a community, Ramirez represents the boons of capitalism, how investment can form a bedrock of community. In short, while the film provides representation of a bad capitalist, it also provides representation of a good one. Even the film's most seemingly anti-American image would be reclaimed by right-wing cinema. As Frank Miller is defeated, the townsfolk come rushing out in droves now that it's safe to do so. Kane turns with hardened eyes to gaze at the citizens who had abandoned him, and then tosses his badge into the dirt. It is a simple but poignant moment. Fred Zinnemann described it as Kane's gesture of contempt for the craven community. Film historian Stephen Prince goes a step further, suggesting it's Kane's repudiation of the town. Whether that contempt or repudiation is about the town itself or a broader statement about the nation on the whole is left to the interpretation of the viewer. But one viewer who definitely interpreted the latter was John Wayne, who seethed with venom about old Gary Cooper tossing his badge, a symbol for U.S. law and authority, into the dirt. But 20 years later, the image of the lawman tossing his badge away in disgust would be echoed in the ending of Dirty Harry, one of the most brazenly and unapologetically right-wing movies ever made in Hollywood. Unexpressed yearning that greater authority be yielded to the police and the rights of citizens rescinded in the name of law and order. There's actually a lot of High Noon in Dirty Harry. Both films pivot around the law releasing a killer after the hero has caught him.
They pardoned Frank Miller.
You're letting him go?
We have to. We can't try him.
Both have the mayor urging the hero not to take action.
I think you better go while there's still time.
Gotta be stopped now.
He's got a busload of kids, and I can't take that chance.
And both conclude with the hero facing the villain head-on anyway, motivated by a higher sense of duty beyond the demands of their job. A true man's man beyond the feckless politicians and simpering legal experts. I'm not exploring these political contradictions to denigrate High Noon. Quite the contrary, I think these complexities result in a far richer and more nuanced movie than a straightforwardly didactic message movie could ever be. But to dispute the notion that the film is some brazen piece of left-wing cinema, explicitly political in content and in form. That certainly wasn't how the film was discussed in 1952. Some outlets did pick up on Foreman's anti-blacklist allegory, notably progressive magazine The Nation. But, come on, that's a left-leaning publication. Of course they were going to be sensitive to the film's leftist sensibilities. But in the mainstream culture of 1952, High Noon was not thought of or discussed as an anti-blacklist or pro-socialist movie. Given John Wayne's antagonism to Carl Foreman and his active role in the Motion Picture Alliance, it is possible he was more attuned to High Noon's left-wing messaging than most, but I am unconvinced that partisan politics alone explains Wayne's hatred. There was something deeper about High Noon that got under John Wayne's skin. And to discuss this, we need to finally talk about Wayne's rebuttal. Hey, just wanted to take a quick break to say if you're enjoying the video, please consider checking out my Patreon. Your support helps make videos like this possible, and you also get access to all sorts of exclusive material, like special top 5 and top 10 lists. This year, I've also been posting a series of exclusive audio reviews every week covering the complete filmography of Alfred Hitchcock. All that and more is available at patreon.com/eyebrowcinema. Rio Bravo was made in response to High Noon. John Wayne would find a kindred spirit, a fellow hater in director Howard Hawks. Hawks also leaned conservative, but he was far less politically engaged than John Wayne, and accordingly, his own stated objections to High Noon were less bound by notions of patriotism. Said Hawks of the film, "I don't think a good sheriff was going to go running around town like a chicken with his head off asking for help, and finally his Quaker wife had to save him." Hawks's Western would do the exact opposite. The setting is another archetypical frontier town, with all the usual genre hallmarks, the same spaces where much of High Noon's action occurred. The hero is Sheriff John T. Chance, who has arrested the vile Joe Burdett for murder and is holding him prisoner until the U.S. Marshal can take Joe out of town to be tried. Trouble is, Joe's brother is the powerful land baron Nathan Burdett, who's hired a whole army of gunslingers to spring Joe. Chance is faced with overwhelming odds, but unlike Will Kane, he doesn't ask for anyone's help. Chance is even offered help from an old friend, which he turns down. He's only interested in working with professionals, even if that makes the job harder. Both films set up comparable scenarios of lawmen vastly outnumbered and outgunned, forced to wait for an inevitable showdown, but both men face that challenge completely differently. Indeed, despite the shared setup, the films are fundamental opposites at several levels. High Noon was produced independently. Rio Bravo was a major studio production. High Noon was budgeted at a modest $750,000, which was Wayne's fee alone for Rio Bravo. Fred Zinnemann had never directed a Western before High Noon and would never return to the genre. Howard Hawks had already directed 3 Westerns before Rio Bravo and would direct 2 unofficial Rio Bravo remakes afterwards. High Noon was shot in grainy black and white in the squared Academy aspect ratio. Rio Bravo was shot in widescreen Technicolor. High Noon runs a lean 84 minutes and plays out in an approximation of real time. The tension is relentless. There's no time for idle chit-chat, no time for comic relief. Kane is all business as he searches desperately for some help, as every second counts down to Miller's arrival. Rio Bravo is a leisurely affair, a 2-hour and 20-minute hangout movie full of downtime that's occasionally interrupted by an action scene. There's a looming threat, sure, but the film is much more concerned with the interpersonal relationships. Chance's surrogate father role to his deputy Dude, as the latter struggles with his alcoholism and self-loathing. Chance's befuddlement at the flirtations of new girl in town, Feathers, and even just Chance's friendship with Carlos, the clownish owner of the town's hotel. And crucially, these scenes run the gamut, from heart-wrenching drama to outright farce. Even the similarities between films reveal their core differences. Both movies feature music from composer Dmitri Tiomkin, including an iconic original song. High Noon has Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darlin', Rio Bravo has My Rifle, My Pony, and Me. The former is heard repeatedly throughout High Noon, and its melody is also worked into Tiomkin's score, while its lyrics overtly comment upon the film's plot, the coming threat of Frank Miller, the challenge posed to Will and Amy's marriage, and Kane's moral responsibility to stay and fight. The function is akin to a Greek chorus, a non-diegetic performance which comments on the action and reiterates the story and themes. The latter is heard only once in Rio Bravo. Chance and his friends are hanging around the sheriff's office, and Dude starts singing a song about the quiet, simple cowboy life. Colorado and Stumpy join in on guitar and harmonica, all while Chance looks on approvingly. The scene does have a narrative function, a counterpoint to an earlier song the bad guys performed to intimidate the heroes by boasting that they would show no quarter. But I'd be lying if I said the scene's primary appeal is its role in the plot. No, the appeal is more simply as the quintessential hangout scene in Rio Bravo, a reprieve from the plot, a moment of utter joy and warmth in the presence of good friends. But for all the ways in which High Noon and Rio Bravo oppose each other, one realm in which they don't is politics. You might assume, based on Rio Bravo's origins, that it be an openly reactionary film, and indeed, Robin Wood has described that there was a time where it was almost obligatory to refer to Rio Bravo as the right-wing answer to High Noon. But in fact, it and High Noon's politics are much closer than you might think. No, there's no anti-blacklist subtext in Rio Bravo, no matter how much you squint, and Hawks was no lefty, but his film does share a similar suspicion of the corrosive influence of capital. Rio Bravo's villains are defined by their access to wealth. All of their evil is empowered through that access. It's that wealth which allows Nathan to hire his own private army to stand against Chance, literally so rich that he can bypass the appointed law of the community and install his own. Dialogue also hints at Nathan's expansion, driving people off their land and out of their homes to enrich himself.
I see you still have a little grudge against us.
460 acres might be little to you, Nathan, but it was a lot of country to me.
It's a moment so brief you might not even notice it, but it's a rather explicit condemnation of the consolidation of wealth and resources in the hands of the few at the expense of everyone else. Then there's Joe, who comes from a family so rich and powerful he can coast through life hurling abuse at anyone he wants, confident few will have the power to stand against him. Even committing murder is little more than an inconvenience. Jonas Henderson demonstrated Capital's potential to influence people to ignore the evils committed around them. The Burdett brothers go one extra step, an example of how Capital empowers people to commit evil themselves. This expression is even rendered symbolically in Rio Bravo, in the recurring image of Burdett and his men mockingly tossing $1 to desperate alcoholic Dude. In Rio Bravo, money allows you to be monstrously cruel. Granted, there are still right-wing elements to be found in the film. In one scene, Chance has a handful of Burdett's men unarmed and held at gunpoint, and as his anger mounts, he attacks one unprompted. Wood notes a, quote, quasi-fascist attitude to power and the right to superfluous violence, Chance inflicting violence for the fun of it. He also notes that this is contrasted by Dude killing in self-defense in the same scene, who also talks down Chance from his violent outburst.
Chance? I'm not gonna hurt him.
For Wood, this is a moment where Dude demonstrates moral superiority, and it's also consistent with an earlier scene where Chance offers Dude a chance to attack Joe and take some measure of revenge for his cruelty, but Dude refuses.
That'd be too easy. He's got nobody to back him up.
At the same time, given Chance's role as Dude's mentor and father figure, as well as how much of the John Wayne persona's appeal was a man of action who took the bad guys to task, a viewer is just as positioned to uncritically enjoy Chance's reactionary violence as they are to see it as an indicator of Dude's moral supremacy. More simple and more present throughout the film is Chance's individualist attitude, his refusal to ask for help, and his pride in being self-sufficient. These are certainly compatible with broadly defined conservative values about pulling oneself up by the bootstraps and not asking for handouts, but these alone are not enough to indicate a right-wing movie. Especially since, for all Chance's supposed self-sufficiency, the plainly observable fact is he does need help all the way through Rio Bravo, and he always gets it. From the jump, he's backed by Stumpy, holed up in the jail guarding Joe, and his deputy Dude. As the film goes, he's also joined by a young sharpshooter in Colorado, and that whole crew gets in on the climax. But at no point does Chance have to fight alone. In every set piece, every confrontation with Burdett and his men, he has help. Even Feathers provides the crucial distraction that saves Chance when he's held at gunpoint. Chance may fancy himself an individualist, but the film itself is distinctly communal. Not in the broader social or institutional sense, there's little indication of the town's social structure or even its inhabitants outside of the main characters, but in its ensemble cast, in its emphasis on a found family who lean on each other for support. Stumpy, forced off his home by a ruthless land baron, is kept employed by Chance, despite Stumpy's age and disability, and given new purpose. Stumpy then helps guide Chance's mentorship of Dude as he struggles with the depths of alcoholism and depression, who in turn provides a moral counterbalance to Chance. They all and more come together to fight against a corruption plaguing their home, and they also come together to simply enjoy each other's company. Ironically, Rio Bravo ends up being far more pro-community and anti-individualist than High Noon. Kane is cast out by his community, and he too rejects them. He does receive some help from his wife, but only at the last minute, and only after already heading out to face the danger alone, elevated beyond the rest of Hadleyville. Chance is utterly immersed in community. He cannot go it alone, and he never has to. And that complicates the relationship between films. If they aren't political opposites, if Chance is also going to need help from his community, then why the antagonism? The simple truth is Foreman and Zinnemann touched a nerve. Hawks and Wayne's problem with High Noon wasn't that it was too left-leaning, and it wasn't that its hero needed help either. It's that he had the indignity to ask for help, that he would degrade himself by showing such vulnerability at all. Such weakness was fundamentally opposed to how Hawks and Wayne conceptualized masculinity. For Wayne, masculinity was entwined with strength, and indeed, the John Wayne star persona was built around the projection of strength. The John Wayne hero was a typical man's man, a barrel-chested, rugged outdoorsman who could punch your lights out, handle a gun, ride a horse, and put away his alcohol. There was certainly complexity and variation in this persona, including the capacity for deeply flawed characters, Wayne occasionally employing his skills to play tyrants or bullies. But from his swaggering, star-making introduction in Stagecoach to his last scene in final movie The Shootist, where he would rather go out in a blaze of glory than let cancer eat away at him, John Wayne always played strong men. And most of the time, those men were cowboys. Here then comes High Noon, a movie where the cowboy spends the vast majority of the runtime openly afraid, pleading for help. He is played by Wayne's friend, Gary Cooper, who, like Wayne, is getting old. And notably, High Noon does everything it can to emphasize that age. Makeup doesn't hide the wrinkles. In fact, Zinnemann shoots Cooper in harsh light, which shows the years on his face, reminding us that we are watching an old man. That said old man ultimately proves himself adept and capable, successfully gunning down the Miller gang in the climax, doesn't change how heavily the film has showcased his vulnerabilities. It is an undermining of the very archetype Wayne had built his career on. Said Zinnemann himself when discussing the political objections to High Noon, the nervousness about subversion was perhaps not even political, but rather a subconscious worry that the classic myth was in danger of being subverted. The Marshal was not fearless. He was scared. He was not a mythical figure. He was human. Rio Bravo reasserts the cowboy's strength. John T. Chance is not all-powerful, and he certainly doesn't go it alone, but he is never afraid. He's cool as a cucumber, even when held at gunpoint. In the action scenes, Chance's vulnerabilities are downplayed. In the bar scene, it is Dude who is at risk of crumbling psychologically, and Dude who the framing emphasizes as being vulnerable to the nefarious gunman hidden in the rafters, not Chance. By the time of the climax, where Chance and his posse shoot it out with Burdett's faceless army, the film has dropped most pretenses of danger for our heroes, a stark departure from High Noon's desperate cat-and-mouse chase. Rio Bravo's climax is purely indulging in fun, in the power fantasy of Wayne and the boys kicking ass, even making space for comedic banter amidst the shooting.
That wagon's full of dynamite. Jumping Jehoshaphat.
And it is fun, a superbly entertaining finale to a superbly entertaining film. It's also a fantasy, and stands in stark contrast to the real John Wayne. One of the most infamous facts about Wayne is that the man who most defined the image of macho American heroism on screen shirked such duties off of it, accepting deferment from the draft during World War II and opting not to volunteer his services. Wayne did join a USO tour to entertain American troops, but even this paled in comparison to the efforts of fellow stars like Bob Hope and John Garfield. And to be clear, I am not judging Wayne for this. I would not want to fight in a war. The thought of being drafted into one utterly terrifies me. If I was in his position, I can't say I would have done anything differently. But it is a contradiction from Wayne's star persona. Moreover, according to Wayne's family and colleagues, it was a known source of shame for the rest of his life, to the point that Wayne's later staunch conservative politics and efforts leading the Motion Picture Alliance on the battlefields of Hollywood have been understood in part as compensation for his failure to serve on the battlefields of Europe. A movie about how, when faced with crisis, men are gripped with fear, so much so that they refuse the call of action, would naturally have touched Wayne's greatest shame and insecurity. Even putting aside Wayne's war record, or his own persona as a movie cowboy, there are other ways he might have seen himself in High Noon. A year before High Noon's release, an actor named Larry Parks was summoned to testify for HUAC. Parks admitted his own past membership in the Communist Party, but resisted identifying other former members. But as Parks was continually hounded by the committee, he eventually broke down and named names. Afterwards, at a Motion Picture Alliance meeting, President John Wayne expressed sympathy for Parks, applauding him for breaking from party ties and complying with HUAC, and encouraged Hollywood to help the actor find work. The rest of the alliance was not so charitable. Amidst the boos and jeers, gossip columnist Hedda Hopper got up and laid into Wayne for expressing sympathy with a commie rat like Parks, invoking all the innocent boys fighting and dying against communism in the Korean War. After her speech, Hedda sat down, Wayne stood up, apologized, and rescinded his support for Parks, who was released from his Columbia Pictures contract later that year. And you know what this reminds me of? Herb Baker in High Noon, who initially agrees to be deputized and fight the Miller Gang alongside Will Kane, until he finds out he's the only volunteer, quietly backs out, and leaves Kane to his fate. Was John Wayne consciously reminded of Parks when he watched High Noon? I don't know, but either way, the film certainly taps into Wayne's weaknesses and insecurities, which themselves are noticeably absent in Rio Bravo. For whatever character flaws its heroes possess, a lack of courage is not among them. Characters may question their competence, but no one's bravery is ever in question. Everyone is game to fight. Even the disabled Stumpy and the comic relief Carlos arrive to help in the climax.
Turn up next.
Maybe the girl in another flower pot.
Put a pin in that. Howard Hawks' objections to High Noon were less rooted in insecurity than Wayne's, but they were no less personal. Again, we return to Hawks' dismissal of Will Kane as a lawman and authority, running around town like a chicken with his head off, asking for help. For Hawks, a man does not ask for help. A man simply toughens up and does his job without complaint. If others do help him, that's fine, but it would be unbecoming and unprofessional to ask. That attitude is certainly evident in Rio Bravo, in Chance's composure in facing off against Burdett and his men, and in his own stated preference to only work with professionals. That's not to say men aren't vulnerable at all, because Chance certainly is. Most notably, Feathers walks all over him with her flirtations, and is decidedly the aggressor in the romance. Wayne's generally unflappable persona also buckles ever so slightly when focus turns to Dude, and we see glimmers of the ache Chance feels for his surrogate son. But crucially, these are interpersonal relationships. Vulnerability in one's personal life is another matter. When it comes to work, a man hardens up. Professionalism is in fact a core tenet of Howard Hawks' cinema. His movies frequently center the work of his protagonists, and the high degree of competence said protagonists employ within that work. In the words of Andrew Sarris, the Hawksian hero is upheld by an instinctive professionalism. In His Girl Friday, Walter Burns is more in love with his ex-wife Hildy for her capabilities as a journalist than he is for her femininity, and values her more as the ace reporter on his paper than the wife in his home.
What home?
What home? Don't you remember the home I promised you?
Red River devotes large stretches of time to cattle herding, the actual cow work of cowboys. The plot of The Big Sleep is a distant second in terms of importance next to the legwork and the detective process of Private Eye hero Philip Marlowe. Even Land of the Pharaohs, widely regarded as a disaster and one of Hawks' worst movies, still foregrounds the labor of constructing the pyramids and revels in the pride of a job well done. And that pride is also something Hawks himself felt. His attitude towards directing was very workmanlike. Unlike a Fred Zinnemann, who viewed himself as a socially conscious artist whose work engaged in cultural dialogue, Hawks viewed himself as a professional craftsman in service to the audience. If he entertained the audience, then he had done a good job. John T. Chance is informed by this same professionalism. He doesn't ask the townsfolk, the people he works for help. It's his job, and therefore his responsibility. This argument is even invoked in High Noon by a churchgoer asking why he or anyone else should ally themselves with Kane when it is fundamentally Kane's business.
We've been paying good money right along. Now, the first time there's any trouble, we're supposed to take care of it ourselves. Well, what have we been paying for all this time? I say we're not peace officers. This ain't our job.
Evidently, Hawks agreed. And it must be noted that for Hawks, professionalism was also entwined with gender. His films primarily dealt with masculine subjects, with men at work in very traditionally masculine professions, be it as soldiers or pilots or cowboys. His most famous woman professional is of course the ace reporter Hildy Johnson in His Girl Friday, the only woman in the press room, widely acknowledged by her peers as the best in the business. She also spends the film on the precipice of being married and accepting the traditional role of suburban housewife, her conflict boiling down to a choice between the broadly defined masculine world of work or the feminine world of domesticity. When she chooses to reject her fiancé and embrace her professionalism, she also embraces masculinity.
I am, instead of trying to change me into something else. I'm no suburban bridge player, I'm a newspaper man.
That's not to say the women in Hawks' films who embraced their femininity were weak or subservient. Far from it. His filmography is full of tough-as-nails, smart women who went toe-to-toe with the men in their lives. So formidable, they frequently overpowered the men in dialogue and in psychology at least, if not in physicality, refusing to simply conform to what she is told to be and to do.
Say, somebody must have given you an awful beating once.
These qualities are evident in Feathers. One of Rio Bravo's best scenes is when Chance accuses Feathers of cheating at cards, and she completely flips the tables on the sheriff, calling his bluff to search her persons, and definitively proving his accusations are completely off base. Even as she and Chance hint closer and closer to a romance, it remains a negotiated relationship, with back and forth between parties and mutual independence. The Hawksian woman is a strong character. As Robin Wood describes, she is sturdy and independent, yet sensitive and vulnerable, the equal of any man. But Wood, who was just about the most dedicated Howard Hawks fan you'll ever find, also believed the Hawksian woman was a male fantasy. They were strong, in part because a competitive character meant for more on-screen friction for Hawks and his actors to play with, resulting in a more entertaining movie, but also because Hawks himself was attracted to strong women. Accordingly, that strength had to be in proportion to their function as fantasy. And this goes some ways to explaining Hawks' disdain when he describes how Will Kane had to be saved by his Quaker wife. A strong woman is one thing, but for Amy to save Kane and kill one of the gunmen herself, stealing his kill, as it were, was for Hawks emasculating. Even when Amy becomes a more conventional damsel in distress held hostage by Frank Miller, she isn't really saved by Kane. She saves herself from Frank, and that allows Kane to land the killing blow. Compare that to its echo in Die Hard's climax, where John McClane is always in control, Holly only moving on his direction. Feathers does also save Chance at one point, creating a distraction which allows Chance and Colorado to gun down the bad guys. She gets to assist the men, but that is the extent of her involvement in the action. Which brings us right back to this pin.
Turn up next.
Maybe the girl in another flower pot.
No, not the girl. She's completely absent from the film's climax. Even comedy characters Stumpy and Carlos, the latter of whom is not any kind of man of action, show up to help defeat Burdett's men. But not Feathers. Women have no place on this battlefield. The gendered politics of Rio Bravo are the most explicitly right-wing aspect of its response to High Noon. High Noon invokes a standard good girl, bad girl conservative binary with its women characters, only to subvert it. Amy, the blonde-haired white innocent and virginal wife of our hero, Helen, the dark-haired Latina who has a past with men of ill repute. But Amy isn't a submissive housewife. She challenges her husband's values, and unlike the rest of Hadleyville, her initial inaction against the Miller gang is rooted in ideological convictions, a belief in pacifism rather than indecision or cowardice. And Helen isn't bad. She's a pillar of the town, among the most intelligent characters in the film, and treated with respect by the screenplay and the direction.
I don't like anybody to put his hands on me unless I want him to, and I don't like you too.
The two appear opposites, and in many ways are different, but they also form a camaraderie, with Helen even convincing Amy of her personal duty to her husband, resulting in Amy saving Kane in the climax. In one respect, she is forsaking her own vow of pacifism and accepting the values of her husband, but on another level, she is transcending the typically passive role of women in westerns, confined strictly to the domestic sphere and becoming an active agent. Rio Bravo reinstates those more traditional patriarchal divisions. It presents in Feathers a character who is explicitly strong, a force of personality that can't easily be contended with by the male hero, but still relegates her firmly to a domestic sphere. Her place is at the hotel, away from the action, or at best on the periphery of it. Even the shape of each film's romance speaks to their gendered divisions. Rio Bravo's love story follows a pretty standard formula. Guy meets girl, guy and girl's personalities clash a bit, but they're clearly attracted to each other, guy and girl fall in love and end the film together. Feather's arc is one of domestication. She begins the film a traveling free spirit and gambler, and ends the film confessing to Chance the kind of girl she used to be before becoming his girl. The kind of girl who'd only wear sexy tights for her man.
These tights. Now, why didn't you want me to wear them?
Because I didn't want anybody but me to see you in them.
Oh, I like that.
It is a film which ends in the comfortable embrace of domesticity, something David Arnold notes is foreshadowed in the lyrics to the film's iconic song, My Rifle, My Pony, and Me. Our cowboy heroes sing about a cowboy who decides to quit drifting and return to his sweetheart and the comforts of home life. Comin' home, sweet darlin', round the bend, where she'll be waitin'. The warm embrace of domesticity is the destination. High Noon is different. As Gwendolyn Foster notes, the film, rather unconventionally, does not end with the happy wedding scene, it begins with it, and then that domestic union is torn asunder by conflict. The couple are still together by film's end, but are in a fundamentally different place together than they were at the start, isolated from their old community and their future uncertain. If Kane expected a subservient wife, then Amy's defiance has fully shattered his notions. If Amy expected Kane to simply walk away from his past and just be her husband, then his inability to let Frank Miller go has fully shattered hers. There is, of course, some ambiguity here. That Kane and Amy's marriage at least survived this movie may well suggest that the couple could survive just about anything. It's hard to think of a greater test on literally the first day of a marriage than what High Noon offers. On the other hand, that such fractures have already been exposed in the foundations of their marriage casts a shadow of doubt on its viability. High Noon begins with the peak of domestic bliss and ends by questioning if such domestic comforts, the same domestic comforts that Rio Bravo builds to, are actually sustainable. And yet, even within these patriarchal confines, Rio Bravo's gender politics are more complex than just being a right-wing response to High Noon. It's worth reiterating the sheer force of strength Feathers demonstrates on screen. She may be confined to the domestic sphere, but she is a premier example of how dynamic, compelling, and dignified a character within that sphere can be. Meanwhile, the film's representations of masculinity are varied and complex. Especially noteworthy is Dude, who Hawks himself noted was the real heart of the movie, and his desperate struggles with alcoholism and depression. Hawks may have prided himself on professionalism, but he also knew a lack of vulnerabilities in your heroes makes for a pretty boring movie, and accordingly, Dude's vulnerabilities are rendered on screen potently. My heart aches for this character on every watch, and Hawks treats him with empathy. Chance is an imperfect father figure, swaying between a hardened and arguably harmful tough love approach and a gentler hand, but the love and support is genuine and consistently felt. And while I've described their relationship as of surrogate father and son, it is also possible to flip the gender. Dude may call Chance Papa,
Yes, Papa.
but David Arnold reads him as a mother hen nurturing the young man in his care. And if you're looking for images of non-toxic masculinity in classic Hollywood cinema, I doubt you could do much better than the sing-along scene. A group of men of different ages, temperaments, and backgrounds coming together to sing about their loves and desires. There is no judgment and no competition, just bliss in each other's company. It is one of the most touching expressions of male bonding I have ever seen. And while the film's ending might seem more conventional and patriarchal, an endorsement of, quote, traditional, heterosexual domestic economies, there are nuances to it worth parsing. Nuances that in fact complement High Noon's ending. While the tone of each film's ending is remarkably different, from the shattered illusions of High Noon to the shift into the loving embrace of domesticity in Rio Bravo, what the films share is a sense that its central couple will continually have to negotiate the bounds and expectations of their relationship. This is explicit in Rio Bravo, with Feathers talking about what she'll have to get used to from Chance, and what Chance will have to get used to from her, as well as the changes one might make to accommodate the other. The mood is optimistic. There is a belief that they can successfully negotiate what the relationship will look like, and regardless of outcome, they are excited to start. High Noon's concluding minutes are much more muted. Kane and Amy literally don't say a single word, but they do ride off together, and while the future of their marriage is left in question, what is clear is that they will continue to try to make things work. For all their differences in gender politics, both films conclude that domesticity is not a set and stable category. It is a fluid, negotiated space. Given that overlap, as well as the many similarities in politics and broader themes, you might expect High Noon and Rio Bravo to coexist harmoniously despite the latter's contentious origins. And to a point they have. Both films have always been popular, both box office hits in their own day, both well-liked by general audiences, and both kept alive through theatrical re-releases, TV airings, and a plethora of physical media releases across many different formats. They are both classics, no question about it. But if we look at who praised which film and why, we start to see some serious division. High Noon was widely celebrated by middle-brow prestige institutions, sources with a veneer of class and taste, but who rarely strayed too far from the mainstream and generally responded positively to films which conveyed an inherent seriousness. Long-standing New York Times film critic Bosley Crowther loved High Noon, and so did the Academy Awards. In addition to Cooper's Best Actor win, the film was also nominated for a slew of other Oscars, and is often considered the movie that should have won Best Picture over the bloated and boring The Greatest Show on Earth. Half a century later, the film was honored by the American Film Institute, who not only named High Noon the second best American Western ever made, but also ranked it quite highly across a half dozen other lists, including in their lists of the top 100 greatest American movies. Rio Bravo was also well reviewed, but it did not receive the wholesale embrace of the middle-brow prestige gatekeepers. It wasn't nominated for any Oscars, it didn't crack the AFI's top 10 westerns, or indeed any AFI list. It was a good movie, but it was not perceived as a serious movie upon release. Like most Howard Hawks films, it was great entertainment, but not great art. This presumption would be challenged by the auteurists, initially French film critics in the 50s and 60s, and later their American disciples in the 60s and beyond. Auteur theory, in so many words, argues that a film's director is its primary author, and that a film's artistry can be measured as the artistry of the director. For the auteur critics, Hawks was an exemplar auteur director, overlooked by the prestige American institutions as just another entertainer, in favor of more self-consciously serious fare like High Noon, but a director who showed tremendous versatility in the range of genres he excelled within, while maintaining a persistent vision in his unshowy formalism, unpretentious cinematic style, and recurring thematic interests like his aforementioned professionalist streak, as well as an ability to maintain that vision while working within the commercial confines of Hollywood cinema. This elevation of Hawks was accompanied by a denigration of Fred Zinnemann and High Noon. Zinnemann wasn't considered anywhere near the caliber of auteur as Howard Hawks, if he could even be called an auteur at all. Before High Noon, Zinnemann was generally thought of as a Hollywood journeyman, highly experienced and skilled, but not particularly noteworthy. In fact, part of what made him so attractive to High Noon's producers was that he could be hired at a low price. The film's success propelled Zinnemann to the higher ranks of Hollywood prestige filmmakers, and he would find future success with Oscar-heavy hitters. But these kinds of ponderous, self-serious movies the Academy loved are the exact same kind the auteurist critics resented. Well-crafted, but lacking the idiosyncratic spark they were looking for. Even a complimentary assessment, like the one offered by Louis Giannetti in Masters of the American Cinema, still titles its Zinnemann chapter Films of Conscience, suggesting a respectability, but also a dullness, whereas the Howard Hawks chapter is titled The Cult of Personality. Andrew Sarris was less charitable, admitting that Zinnemann's success makes him a mandatory component in the history of American cinema, but argued, quote, his true vocation remains the making of anti-movies for anti-movie goers, concluding that there is not in Zinnemann enough of the redeeming outrageousness of the compulsive entertainer. These quotes come from the American Cinema, Sarris's attempt to rank the major directors into a hierarchical canon, and the greatest summation of how the auteurists perceived Hawks versus Zinnemann is in where Sarris ranks each. Hawks is found in the pantheon directors, the creme de la creme, the directors who have achieved transcendence. To speak any of their names is to evoke a self-contained world with its own laws and landscapes. Zinnemann shows up in less than meets the eye, as defined by Sarris, those directors with reputations in excess of inspirations. Of course, Sarris also placed John Huston, Elia Kazan, Joe Mankiewicz, Carol Reed, Billy Wilder, and David Lean in this category, so I think it's fair to say old Andrew got a couple of things wrong. Is Fred Zinnemann one of those things? Well, I'd certainly agree that his personality was relatively muted within his work, certainly more so than Howard Hawks's, and he was more of a craftsman than a capital A auteur. Significantly, while the initial idea for Rio Bravo started with Hawks, the initial idea for High Noon began with screenwriter Carl Foreman. This very video has treated Foreman as a much more central main character than it has Zinnemann. But the wholesale dismissal of Zinnemann's directorial touch is overstated. It ignores how Zinnemann's background in quasi-documentary film would influence his own naturalistic, de-glamorized aesthetics, evident especially in High Noon's grainy black and white look, the film lacking the breathtaking vistas or rousing exuberance of Western escapism, and how essential that look is to informing the film's success. It overlooks Zinnemann's skills with actors, not just drawing great performances out of his stars, but quiet, intimate, subtle evocations of character. Giannetti makes a case that Zinnemann helped introduce method acting to the movies, directing early star roles for Montgomery Clift and Marlon Brando. Even when working with the non-method Gary Cooper, however, an old school of star as they come, with no real formal training as an actor, Zinnemann still elicits a subdued performance, defined more by a suggested interiority than it is external action. And while Zinnemann's personality is less powerful and, yes, less exciting than Hawks's, there are recurring thematic undercurrents to his work. Zinnemann especially returns time and again to the same type of protagonist, a moral person who faces a crisis of conscience brought on by the failure of their community. Often, this communal failure intersects with major political histories, overtly in films like The Nun Story, A Man for All Seasons, and Julia, or covertly, as in High Noon. But even if the wholesale dismissal of Fred Zinnemann's auteur status was completely accurate, that would not actually lessen High Noon. I consider myself an auteurist, but it is not an all-encompassing method for engaging with cinema. It is but one tool, and depending on the context, not necessarily the most fruitful. Additionally, it's important to place these auteurist critiques of Zinnemann and High Noon in the cinematic culture of the 60s and 70s, when auteur theory had not yet been widely accepted, and was in fact still a pretty contentious topic. Its followers were pushing a new method for engaging with cinema, and they received a lot of pushback. They, in turn, had to argue rather loudly and forcefully. A director like Hawks, whose personality oozed through every frame of his filmography, was useful to that fight in a way a competent craftsman like Zinnemann was not. To that end, when Zinnemann died in 1997, at a point when auteur theory was not without controversy, but had more or less been accepted as a legitimate form of film criticism and analysis, the tone shifted. In an essay for Film Comment appropriately titled Day of the Craftsman, film critic Robert Horton admits that, removed from the auteur-anti-auteur battles of the 60s and 70s, Zinnemann's so-called boring craftsmanship was looking better and better. He admits that he still prefers Rio Bravo, but admires High Noon's maturity, the vulnerability of its hero, and the steady hand of its director. There was, however, another component to the critical backlash to High Noon that had less to do with the film's director per se than it did its place within the genre. Much has been said about High Noon's status as an unconventional Western, its lack of sweeping landscapes, that most of its action is relegated to the final scene, and much to the anger of John Wayne and Howard Hawks, that the cowboy hero was so openly vulnerable. But in fact, the film was part of a whole wave of post-war westerns that self-consciously broke from genre conventions, de-emphasizing the heroic adventure of western violence and instead presenting it in a darker and even horrifying context. Miscarriages of justice, or random atrocities, with heroes who were either incapable of escaping their own violent pasts, or who were openly afraid of the challenges they faced. In an essay originally published in 1955, Andre Bazin described such films as super westerns, and he did not mean this as a compliment. For Bazin, quote, "The super western is a western that would be ashamed to just be itself, and looks for some additional interest to justify its existence, an aesthetic, sociological, moral, psychological, political, or erotic interest. In short, some quality extrinsic to the genre which is supposed to enrich it." Bazin cites High Noon as a key film of this movement, and while he does specify that he's not one of those critics who turn up their noses at High Noon, and that he likes the film fine, he also makes a point of praising Howard Hawks for continuing to make traditional, quote, genuine westerns at a time when the super western was most in vogue. He was talking about Red River and the Big Sky, but he could just as easily have been talking about Rio Bravo, and had he lived long enough to see it, I have no doubt what side of the debate Bazin would have fallen on. Robin Wood picked up on this super western concept, arguing much of the appeal of High Noon to the middle-brow prestige institutions of the world rested on its reputation as a serious western, a film which confers dignity on a low genre by infusing it a seriousness of moral purpose. Richard Maltby derisively described High Noon as a static film, which pursued its seriousness relentlessly, exhaustingly.
My father and my brother were killed by guns. They were on the right side, but that didn't help them any when the shooting started.
I'm not trying to be a hero. If you think I like this, you're crazy.
It's all for nothing, Will. It's all for nothing.
While praising Rio Bravo for its purity as escapism, a diverting illusion, which accepts that its only goal is to entertain. In essence, what these critics were objecting to was a condescending attitude that High Noon was more than just a western. A more modern example of this would be the backlash to the so-called elevated horror films across the last decade, and specifically the suggestion that previous horror movies were shallow, superficial, and stupid, only achieving a level of depth and artistry when they became more explicit in their metaphors and messaging. And it's hard not to be sympathetic to that argument, especially since I too love a lot of the classic westerns that the Bazins of the world are referring to. Zinnemann and Stanley Kramer also really did not make things any easier on themselves by repeatedly saying things like, they didn't see High Noon as a Western per se, but just as a great story that happened to take place in the Old West. Filmmakers, do not do this if you are working within a genre. It never goes well. It will not endear you to the people most likely to watch your movie. It is also certainly true that High Noon carries itself with a self-seriousness, a largely humorless affair that feels all the heavier when compared to Rio Bravo's lightness. But for all its heaviness, High Noon is still very much a Western, and a rather entertaining Western at that. It's the story of a marshal, played by an iconic old cowboy, defending his town and his honor against a gang of despicable gunmen, with the entirety of the film building to the inevitable shootout. I don't care that it lacks those sweeping vistas or that it's light on action until the climax. Every fiber of the film's aesthetics and narrative aligns it with Western tradition. The notion that the film's serious tone crosses over into a preachiness, what Pauline Kael described as a Western used for a civics lesson, is also unconvincing. Much more present than any civics lesson or the greater moral purpose Wood spoke derisively about is High Noon's unbearable tension as the clock counts down for Will Kane. If there is one other genre High Noon belongs to, it's not the message movie, it's the thriller, and it is thrilling, every moment imbued with a tension that swells larger and larger until it can't be contained any longer. High Noon might not entertain the same way that Rio Bravo does, but it most certainly does entertain. I can't help but wonder if the perception of High Noon amidst its detractors as a self-impressed, self-important message movie is less in response to the film itself and more the associations of the producer. I haven't said a ton about Stanley Kramer throughout this video, largely because of the three men who led High Noon's production. He strikes me as the least essential, but his name is quite literally all over the movie. And Kramer had a certain reputation. Before High Noon, Kramer had already built his name as the producer of socially conscious message movies from a liberal perspective. By the end of the 50s and through the 1960s, Kramer would begin directing those movies himself, and while his directorial efforts weren't bad, they were...
He thinks you're gonna faint because he's a Negro.
Blunt. If Kramer makes a movie about race in America, it's about a white guy and black guy literally chained together. If he makes a movie about the aftershock of Nazi Germany, it's literally about the Nuremberg trials. If he makes a movie about interracial romance, not only will the black lead be a model minority, but he will also be entirely without fault of any kind and an uber-humanitarian doctor. The kind of man so perfect, the only possible objection anyone could have would be on the grounds of race. Stylistically, Kramer's work was functional enough, but dry. So dry as to make Zinnemann look like Federico Fellini. And again, I'm not saying these movies were bad. I like a lot of these movies, but they were also the kinds of movies those hip auteurist critics despised. Message movies where the message was blunt, unavoidable, and ultimately more important than the film's cinematic qualities. I suspect that Kramer Association influenced a lot of High Noon's most vicious critics, and their diagnosis that the film was straining, self-serious, and didactic. Because the actual film is pretty far removed from Kramer's preachy lectures. It has a social conscience, sure, but it's steeped in allegory, more so than Kramer's own directorial efforts, or indeed than Zinnemann's future films, which tackled their social problems much more directly. And as this video has already discussed, that allegory was actually pretty elusive. Despite Foreman's intentions, the film was not generally regarded as a blacklist movie upon release, and even decades later, when those intentions are public knowledge, the film's meaning remains flexible. High Noon certainly lacks Rio Bravo's looseness, its carefree sense of fun, and by the same token, Rio Bravo lacks High Noon's sense of urgency and economic storytelling. But neither lack is a shortcoming. It is not failure, but a difference in priorities, indicative of films with shared origins and divergent outcomes. Distinct, Yet despite the animosity that fueled the creation of one of the films, not actually in conflict. Having covered the backstory of High Noon and Rio Bravo, comparing their aesthetics and politics, and the diverging reception of both, there's really only one question left to answer. Which film do I like more? It's a question I've been asked throughout production of this video, and it's tough. Both are excellent. 5-star classics more than worthy of their spot in the canon of American cinema, or of cinema more broadly. They also make for very different experiences. One is a nail-biting thriller, where every second ticks closer towards doom. The other is a leisurely hangout piece, with spikes of excitement to be sure, but where it's just as easy to drift between scenes in a carefree haze. You could also make sweeping generalizations about the kind of person who'd prefer one film to the other, which itself would reveal where you stand. If you prefer High Noon, you could swipe at Rio Bravo fans by saying some people just want fun escapism instead of more sobering, serious, allegorical work. Alternatively, the Hawks heads could snipe back that the High Noon fans want movies to impart moral lessons rather than cinematic craft. But neither of these judgments are fair. They ignore that High Noon is also a very entertaining and well-crafted piece of filmmaking, and that Rio Bravo is also full of subtext and thematic richness for those looking for it. Moreover, it's not like you're only allowed to like one flavor of Western. Preference is just as likely to be determined by one's mood in a given moment. You might also speculate where I stand based on my personality. I am a progressive, what my less charming commenters would call a woke SJW, so surely I'm going to prefer the liberal allegory with the better gendered and racial representation. But I am also an auteurist, so much so that my own top 100 favorite movies list and my personal Blu-ray collection are organized by director, so surely I'm going to prefer the auteurist's movie to the solid craftsman's. Ultimately though, the more I think about this question, the more only one answer makes sense to me.
Why can't you have both? You need to pick one. I refuse the question. You need to pick one. No, I don't.
That's right. I'm taking the fence-sitter option and refusing to put one film above the other. I like High Noon and Rio Bravo.
I'm just wondering which one you like more. I like them both. You can't have both. Yes, you can.
But it's not just that I love both movies, and it's also not just that direct comparison is fundamentally a case of apples and oranges. It's that, for as much as the film's origins and ensuing histories would suggest they be natural enemies, they work much better as complementary texts. Removed from the personal animosities of the creators and the political violence wreaked by the blacklist, we can gauge High Noon and Rio Bravo more simply as movies engaged in a shared dialogue. This video has frequently brought up their synergy in their narratives of tough men of action who nonetheless need a little help to get by, in their shared criticisms of the buckling of legal systems under capitalist pressures, and even in their exploration of domesticity as a continually negotiated union. The films are not the same in these regards, but they operate in tandem, speaking directly to each other. The difference is that Rio Bravo is aspirational, and High Noon is a cautionary tale. Rio Bravo is a joyous story of a community come together. In Robin Wood's words, the film is an argument as to why we should all want to go on living and fighting. High Noon is a warning of what happens when communities fracture, when people are cut off, isolated from each other, and cast out. But it is not without hope. Kane and Amy do successfully defeat the Miller Gang and venture forth into an unknown future. It's unclear if their marriage will work, but it is clear they're still going to try. They have hope, and it's that spark of hope that Rio Bravo fully ignites. There's an old maxim attributed to the film critic turned filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard. In order to criticize a movie, you have to make another movie. John Wayne and Howard Hawks had much to criticize in High Noon, and their cinematic rebuttal is the best kind of film criticism. Not an evisceration, High Noon destroyed by facts and logic, but an expansion, a complication, film criticism that enriches the film it's critiquing, and is itself made better by the object of its critique. High Noon is richer, because Rio Bravo exists. Its despairing portrait of fractured community is all the more cutting when countered by Rio Bravo's warmth and solidarity. Rio Bravo is richer because High Noon exists. Its optimism and kindness are all the more nourishing because of High Noon's reminder of how rare and ultimately fragile those values are.
So long, Mark. So long.
The Western genre is vaster and more comprehensive because both films are engaged in a dialogue with each other. One reminds us how hard life can be. The other reminds us why it's worth it all the same. I don't begrudge anyone their preferences. My own could well sway depending on the day. Ultimately, I'm just happy we have both.
My pony